What happens when the last, desperate hope of an empire sets sail, carrying not only its cannons and steel hulls, but its pride, its fears, and a fate already etched into history? In 1905, as the world tilted on the edge of modern warfare, two empires clashed in the Far East. Russia, colossal in size but slow to adapt, was being outpaced by an island nation it once underestimated, Japan. What began as a regional power play quickly became a proving ground for two visions of the future. For Russia, the losses had already been staggering. Its Pacific Fleet, once anchored in Port Arthur, had been crippled, morale had collapsed, diplomats floundered, protests brewed within the streets of St. Petersburg. The Tsar needed a symbol, a turning point, a victory. And so, the Second Pacific Squadron was formed, a fleet of ambition, stitched together in haste. At its heart were modern battleships, armed with powerful guns and thick armor, but surrounding them were aging cruisers, lumbering support ships, and coal transports never designed to follow a fleet across oceans. Some ships had names worthy of legend, others were barely seaworthy. They would travel farther than any naval force had ever attempted before, from the Baltic Sea, past the coasts of Africa, around the southern tip of Asia, toward the Sea of Japan. 18,000 miles of uncertainty. From the moment their anchors lifted, the warning signs emerged. The hulls were fouled from long neglect, already dragging speed. Coal, the lifeblood of the fleet, was in constant shortage, food stores spoiled, machines groaned under the weight of wear, and perhaps most crippling of all, the men themselves. Sailors whispered at night, not of glory, but of ghosts. They scrubbed decks with salt-bitten hands, wrote letters home they doubted would ever arrive, and wondered if they were sailing toward redemption or toward a watery grave. Among them stood Admiral Rojestvensky, a man of duty and fire, burdened with command. He knew what awaited them. He understood that this journey was not just about strategy or strength, it was about surviving the burden of expectation. But the fleet moved forward, bound by orders and by a hope that perhaps they were not machines, they were not steel, they were men. Behind every bulkhead, beneath every turret, inside every soot-stained corridor of the Second Pacific Squadron lived thousands of human stories, young and old, hopeful and hardened. And as the ships creaked forward across oceans, it was these men, not their cannons, who bore the real weight of war. Life on board was not romantic. It was raw. The air below deck was heavy with the stink of coal dust and sweat. The food, when it came, was often moldy bread, salted meat that reeked of rot, and water that tasted of rusted metal. There was no fresh fruit, no comfort, no privacy. Disease spread easily. Skin infections, fever, and stomach ailments haunted the lower decks like silent predators. Washing was rare. Clothes stuck to the body, stiff with salt and grime. Men shaved with seawater. They slept in shifts, shoulder to shoulder, always half awake, always half dreaming of something far away. They missed home. Letters were treasured like relics. Some read them every night, their fingers tracing familiar handwriting. Others wrote without knowing if their words would ever find their destination. One sailor wrote in his journal, "Mother, the sea is vast. I think of your
Did you
bread,
hear the one about the
your
seagull
voice,
and the first mate?
and the trees beyond our
not
home.
this again.
If I return, I will
Always a
never leave
classic.
again. But I wonder if the sea has already claimed me." There were moments of laughter, of course, moments stolen between storms and drills, a game of cards, a half-tuned accordion wheezing out a folk tune. But beneath it all simmered a quiet dread. The officers felt it too. Admiral Rojestvensky walked the decks in silence, often alone. A man known for discipline and anger, he now wore a face of calculation and concern. He knew his men were tired. He saw the haunted eyes, the slumped shoulders. He knew the coal was running low, the boilers strained, supplies dwindled, discipline frayed. He knew something worse, that this was not just a journey of miles, but of morale. Rojestvensky was not a coward, nor a fool, but even he, in the quiet moments before sleep, must have wondered, can we reach Vladivostok?
He could not speak such fears aloud.
So he kept walking, kept planning, kept commanding. But below deck, the sailors whispered. They speculated, they feared. Some joked about torpedoes, others talked seriously about death, what it would feel like to drown, to burn, to be forgotten in the belly of the sea. They carried their fears in silence, in worn boots, in the way they stared too long at the horizon. They were men who loved their country, but they were also men who missed their children, who hadn't tasted apples in months, who had forgotten the feeling of dry earth. And as the ships crawled ever closer to the Tsushima Strait, the tension became physical, like a storm building, not outside, but within. They were not machines, they were not steel, they were men. And soon, they would be tested like never before. There are places on a map that mean little, just water and names. And then there are places like the Tsushima Strait, a narrow body of water separating Korea from Japan. Calm on the surface, but beneath its waves, history waited to be made. For the Russian fleet, it was the final passage to safety, to Vladivostok. For the Japanese, it was the trap, the perfect battleground. The geography gave them the edge, strong currents, predictable wind, limited maneuvering room. Whoever controlled Tsushima controlled the tempo of battle. Japan knew this, and they prepared. For months, Admiral Tōgō had drilled his fleet with a singular purpose, to stop the Russians at sea, once, decisively, forever. Tōgō was no ordinary commander, calm, patient, brilliant. He didn't just train his sailors, he forged them. Under his leadership, every gun crew rehearsed until movements were muscle memory. Torpedo teams ran night drills in blackout conditions. Signal officers practiced complex maneuvers in silence. The entire fleet operated like one single organism, responsive, ruthless, ready. Their ammunition was modern. Their shells, packed with Shimose powder, burned hotter and exploded more violently than anything the Russians could deliver. Their ships were clean, fast, maneuverable. Their officers were young, sharp, and utterly loyal. Tōgō didn't wait for the Russians to arrive. He anticipated them. He studied currents, plotted interception points, predicted delays. He knew, better than the Russians did themselves, when and where they would appear. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Russian fleet was still crawling eastward, slow, overburdened, and visibly exhausted. Every mile cost coal, every port stop cost time. Refueling took days, engines faltered, boilers overheated, the tropical heat warped minds and machinery alike. Their planning had cracks. The fleet was too large, too disorganized. Signals were misunderstood. Coordinating dozens of vessels, battleships, cruisers, colliers, supply ships, over thousands of miles was a nightmare. By the time they neared Tsushima, their formation was a patchwork. Ships that had aged 10 years in 10 months. Paint peeled from their hulls, some turrets jammed. The coal was damp and the powder unreliable. They were not marching into battle. They were drifting into an ambush. And still, Rojestvensky hoped. He believed that discipline and will might carry them through. But the contrast was growing impossible to ignore. On Japanese decks, sharp uniforms, polished brass, clear orders. On Russian decks, rust, fatigue, and silence. As the two fleets moved toward each other across the sea, one calm, one strained, a collision of preparation and desperation was imminent. Tsushima wasn't just a place, it was the blade waiting in the dark.
There is a silence that falls before battle.
A stillness so heavy it feels like the ocean holds its breath. On the morning of May 27, 1905, that silence hung thick over the Tsushima Strait. Russian sailors stood at their stations, grim, pale, waiting. Officers barked orders, signals were raised, final inspections swept across the decks. Somewhere beyond the mist, the enemy waited. Then, a flicker of white on the horizon. Japanese scouts. The Russians braced. And then came the first of many mistakes. A hospital ship, under strict neutrality, mistakenly identified a Japanese vessel as friendly. It signaled, revealing the Russian fleet's exact location. The Japanese needed no further invitation. Admiral Tōgō's main battle fleet moved swiftly, decisively. He had trained for this, he had planned for this. The Russians scrambled to form a line, but months of exhaustion, broken communication, and sluggish vessels made order impossible. Gaps widened, signals went unseen. One battleship turned the wrong way, collapsing the entire formation. At 2:10 p.m., Tōgō made his now legendary move, the crossing of the T. He positioned his fleet perpendicular to the Russian line, bringing all his guns to bear, while the Russians could only fire forward. It was a textbook maneuver, lethal in execution. The first salvos of Shimose shells struck with terrifying impact. They didn't just explode, they erupted. High above the decks, in the rigging, on the bridges, everything caught fire. One sailor recalled, "The sky split apart with thunder, then fire fell like rain." Russian ships burned. Black smoke poured skyward. Fire crews battled in vain. Shells ripped through command posts. Masts shattered. Blood soaked the decks. And yet, amidst the chaos, they fought. Gunners continued to fire, even as their hands blistered. Lookouts shouted through smoke. Some ships managed to regroup, to return fire. But their shots lacked precision. Their shells often failed to detonate. For every Japanese strike, there were 10 Russian misses. By late afternoon, the Russian fleet was broken, not yet destroyed, but unraveling. And then for the Russians, it was pure terror. Spotlights flashed, alarms rang, but it was chaos. No clear orders, no coordinated defense, just ships turning wildly, some colliding, others drifting. Men ran blindly, fell overboard, or jumped into burning water to escape the flames. Below decks, compartments flooded, boilers exploded. A captain issued a final order, then stayed with his sinking ship. A junior sailor, clinging to debris, later wrote, "I could hear the sea hissing on the hot metal, then silence, then screams." By midnight, what had begun as a fleet was now a collection of wrecks, and through it all, the Japanese moved with grim precision, cold, efficient, unrelenting. The Battle of Tsushima wasn't simply a fight, it was a reckoning, a clash between order and collapse, between preparation and inevitability. And as the sun set behind clouds of smoke, the waters of the Tsushima Strait turned dark, not from nightfall alone, but from the shadows of dying ships and dreams.
By the dawn of May 28,
1905, the Russian fleet was no longer a fleet. Its flagship, the Knyaz Suvorov, had been crippled. Admiral Rozhdestvensky, wounded and unconscious, was no longer in command. The chain of leadership had fractured. Radios fell silent. Smoke choked the sky. What remained of the Second Pacific Squadron drifted aimlessly, ship by ship, bloodied and broken. In those final hours, the battle became something else entirely. Not a contest between naval powers, but a slow, merciless unraveling. Survivors clung to flaming decks. Some ships, too damaged to steer, surrendered by raising white flags. Others tried to flee toward neutral ports. Many never made it. Of the 38 Russian warships that had entered the strait, only a handful survived. 21 were sunk. Over 5,000 Russian sailors perished, many to fire, many to drowning. Thousands more were captured. Japan, in contrast, lost just 3 torpedo boats. It was, by every measure, a catastrophic defeat for the Russian Empire, and yet, when the surrender was formalized, the Japanese showed restraint. Prisoners were treated with dignity, officers were given courtesies. There was no spectacle, only silence, ceremony, and discipline. The world took notice. Newspapers from London to New York ran headlines in disbelief. Japan defeats a European giant. The rise of the East. In Tokyo, Admiral Tōgō was hailed as a national hero. Parades filled the streets, children sang his name. A once humble island nation had defeated one of Europe's largest empires, at sea, in open battle. But in Russia, it was mourning and rage. Families opened telegrams with trembling hands. Fathers didn't come home. Sons were never found. Factories halted. Railways went on strike. Protest erupted in cities. The loss at Tsushima was not just military, it was psychological. It shattered the myth of Russian invincibility. It eroded public trust in the Tsar. It sparked flames that would burn again in 1905 and later in 1917. And within military circles, hard questions were asked. How had Japan outpaced Russia? Japan's strengths were not just in numbers. They lay in modern gunnery, in the efficiency of Shimose shells, in the discipline of tactics, and in the clarity of command. But more than that, they lay in training, coordination, communication, and logistics. Russia had ships. Japan had a system. This battle rewrote naval doctrine. It exposed the flaws of the old world, the myth that armor alone could win wars. It signaled the beginning of a new age, one where speed, information, precision, and cohesion would decide the future of warfare. In the aftermath, navies around the world took note. Great Britain would soon unveil the HMS Dreadnought, forever changing battleship design. Wireless communication would become essential. Coordination would be doctrine, not suggestion. And yet, beyond tactics and theory, lay the human cost. The men lost at Tsushima, Russian and Japanese alike, left behind more than wreckage. They left behind lessons, warnings. That pride without preparation is deadly. That leadership without listening leads to silence. That ships are only as strong as the men who guide them, and the nation that guides those men. Tsushima was not just a naval battle. It was a mirror held up to empires, and one empire could not bear what it saw. Long after the guns fell silent, Tsushima continued to echo. Its waves rippled not only across the Sea of Japan, but through the navies of the world. Generals, admirals, and strategists studied it, not just as a battle, but as a revelation. It changed everything. The age of ironclads and sheer firepower was over. What mattered now was speed, communication, range, and coordination. Tōgō's disciplined execution showed the world that even the most powerful empire could be brought to its knees, not by brute force, but by superior planning, modern technology, and seamless organization. Nations took note. Naval doctrines were rewritten. The dreadnought class emerged. Torpedoes gained respect. Wireless communication became essential. Logistics, once an afterthought, became strategy. Tsushima didn't just shift the balance of naval power, it ushered in the modern era of naval warfare. But the legacy of Tsushima went beyond blueprints and tactics. It lived in memory, in mourning, in myth. In Japan, Tsushima became a cornerstone of national pride. Admiral Tōgō was enshrined as a legend, his leadership immortalized in textbooks, paintings, even poetry. The battle marked Japan's arrival on the world stage, not as a colony, not as a client, but as a power. In Russia, the legacy was heavier. It haunted the empire's psyche, another crack in the fragile foundation of the Romanovs. In memoirs, letters, and the haunted eyes of survivors, the story lived on, not as triumph, but as tragedy, a lesson in hubris, a cautionary tale. Some families waited years for closure. Some never received a name, only the sea, only silence. Yet, through the fog of history, a question remains. What if? What if the Russians had trained longer? What if their coal had arrived on time? What if Rojestvensky had trusted his junior officers more, or if he'd been replaced by someone else entirely? What if the battle hadn't happened in Tsushima at all? History is not built only on what was, but also on what could have been. And perhaps that's what makes Tsushima endure. It was more than a clash of ships. It was a clash of choices. Technology versus tradition. Clarity versus confusion. Preparation versus pride. Even today, echoes of Tsushima can be heard in the doctrines of global navies, in the engineering of modern warships, in the leadership models of command centers. But more importantly, its lessons extend beyond war. They speak to anyone in charge of people, resources, or responsibility. They remind us that failure is often not born from weakness, but from the refusal to adapt. And yet, was that truly the whole story? Are there diaries we never found, orders never issued, voices that never got to speak? Was the Russian defeat truly inevitable, or simply the result of choices made under pressure far from home? As the sun sets on this story, perhaps it is not an ending, but an invitation to reflect, to learn, to ask harder questions. Because in the quiet aftermath of Tsushima, amid the wreckage and the waves, there are still answers waiting to be found, but only if we're willing to look.